Late one autumn evening, in the forgotten town of Blackwood, students at Crestfall High whispered about the shadowy corridors of their school. It was an ordinary-looking building, its bricks weathered but steadfast. Yet, every year, like clockwork, a peculiar phenomenon gripped the campus. It began with a rumor, spread by trembling freshmen and weary seniors alike. Crestfall High was alive. The school's history was as murky as the fog that blanketed Blackwood. Constructed in the late 1800s, it had served as both a school and a refuge during an influenza outbreak. Many who entered during that grim period never left. Over time, the building expanded, its walls absorbing the laughter and tears of countless students. Yet no one spoke of the oddities too loudly, the echoes of footsteps in empty halls, the faint sound of sobbing from locked closets, and the flickering lights in the library's basement. Maggie, a junior with an insatiable curiosity, was the first to question the stories. She loved the thrill of solving mysteries, dismissing the tales as exaggerated folklore. One October night, as rain tapped against the windows, she convinced her friends, Eli, Clara, and Sam, to stay after hours and explore. With flashlights in hand, they waited for the janitor to leave and slipped through the labyrinthine hallways. The school was unnervingly silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood. Their laughter at the absurdity of their mission gradually faded as they approached the basement. This was the heart of every ghost story, a locked room beneath the library. According to legend, it was sealed after a teacher vanished during detention duty decades ago. Maggie had found a key in the archives, hidden in a dusty envelope labeled "Restricted." The lock resisted at first, as though it had grown accustomed to solitude. With a sharp click, the door swung open, revealing stairs that descended into darkness. The air grew colder as they ventured down, the damp stone walls closing in. Their flashlights illuminated shelves of forgotten textbooks, cobwebs clinging like skeletal fingers. At the center of the room was an old desk, its surface scratched with incoherent carvings. Sam, the skeptic, chuckled nervously. "This is it? A creepy basement full of junk?" But Maggie's eyes were fixed on the carvings. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, a map of the school. At its center was a room that didn't exist on any official plans. Clara gasped, pointing at a phrase scrawled beneath the map, "Let the bell toll." As if summoned, the school's old bell tower let out a deafening clang. The sound reverberated through the walls, and the door slammed shut behind them. Their flashlights flickered, and the room seemed to shift. The walls stretched impossibly high, the shadows deepening into pools of ink. The air was heavy, pressing against their lungs. Then came the whispers. They started softly, indistinguishable, like the wind. But soon they grew louder, forming words. "Why did you come?" Eli screamed, spinning in circles to find the source, but there was no one there. The whispers turned to laughter, childlike, mocking. Maggie grabbed the map and bolted for the stairs, the others following. The steps seemed longer, endless, and the door at the top loomed like a mirage. When they burst through, the school was unrecognizable. The fluorescent lights were replaced by dim, flickering bulbs. The posters and banners that once decorated the halls were gone, replaced with peeling wallpaper. The lockers were rusted, their doors hanging ajar. A distant, rhythmic banging echoed, a sound like metal against bone. "We need to leave," Clara whimpered, clutching Sam's arm. Maggie studied the map, her fingers trembling. "The room on this map, it's marked as the principal's office, but I've never seen it." Eli gestured wildly. "Who cares? We're trapped in whatever this is." But the decision was made when the banging grew louder, accompanied by heavy footsteps. Something was coming. They ran, following the map's twisted path. As they turned corners, the halls seemed to stretch and bend, as though the school itself was alive, reshaping to trap them. They reached the marked room, a heavy oak door with no handle, only a keyhole. Maggie shoved the map into her pocket and inserted the key. The door groaned open, revealing a small, candlelit chamber. At its center was a figure, a woman in an old-fashioned teacher's dress, her back turned, her head tilted slightly as if listening. "Who dares disturb my school?" The figure rasped, her voice both ancient and seething. Maggie stepped forward, her voice shaking. "We didn't mean to." "Silence," the woman snapped, spinning to face them. Her eyes were hollow voids, her skin stretched tight over bone. "You are trespassers, and you must pay." The candles flared, their flames turning black. The air grew colder, and shadows spilled from the corners, coalescing into forms. Students, dozens of them, their faces twisted in agony. They reached for the group with spectral hands, their whispers now a cacophony of cries. Maggie screamed, thrusting the map forward. "We didn't know. We'll leave. Just let us go." The woman paused, her hollow gaze fixed on the map. Her bony hand reached out, plucking it from Maggie's grasp. She studied it, her expression unreadable. "This map belongs to me," she murmured. "It leads to my heart, my curse." The shadows receded slightly, and the woman leaned closer to Maggie. "Destroy it, and perhaps I shall let you live." Without hesitation, Maggie grabbed the map and tore it in half. The woman shrieked, a sound that rattled the very walls. The room dissolved around them, and they found themselves back in the library basement, the door wide open, sunlight streaming through. They never spoke of that night again. The map was gone, as was the strange basement room. But the school remained, its walls humming with secrets, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far.
Story number 2.
One foggy night in the quiet town of Ravenshallow, an eerie unease settled over Blackridge High School. The school was an architectural marvel from a century ago, its Gothic spires reaching into the perpetually gray skies. It was said that the building's foundation was laid atop what once was Gallows Hill, a place infamous for the public hangings of accused witches. But such tales were buried beneath the mundane grind of classes and exams until the year when 4 students vanished without a trace. It began with a single rumor, whispered in the dark: Room 301 is cursed. Room 301, an abandoned classroom on the top floor, had been sealed shut for as long as anyone could remember. The door was chained and padlocked, its frosted windows too dirty to peer through. Most students avoided the area entirely, unnerved by the faint scratching sounds that seemed to emanate from within late at night. But in every generation, there are those who cannot resist the call of the forbidden. Liz, a fearless senior known for her reckless curiosity, decided to investigate. She dragged her friends, Jason, Mia, and Ethan, into her plan, bribing them with promises of glory and the thrill of unraveling the school's darkest secret. They chose Halloween night for their expedition, when the moonlight would be their only witness. Breaking into the school after dark was easier than expected. Liz's bobby pin skills made short work of the locks, and soon they were climbing the creaking stairs to the 3rd floor. The air grew heavier the closer they got, carrying a metallic tang that made their tongues tingle. At the end of the dim hallway, room 301 loomed. "Let's get this over with," Jason muttered, holding the bolt cutters Liz had brought. The chain fell away with a metallic clang, echoing down the empty corridor. Liz pushed the door open, and the stench of decay hit them like a wall. The room was bathed in shadows, the air thick with dust and something more sinister. Desks were overturned, their surfaces scarred with deep gouges. On the chalkboard, faint words were scrawled in a language none of them recognized. At the center of the room stood a single desk, perfectly upright, its surface pristine. Resting on it was an antique music box, its brass surface tarnished with age. The group gathered around it, a mix of awe and apprehension on their faces. "Don't touch it," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Liz ignored her. With a sly grin, she wound the key. The box creaked to life, playing a haunting melody that seemed to vibrate in their bones. As the notes filled the air, the room began to change. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening until they felt like a living entity. "Turn it off!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. Liz tried, but the key wouldn't budge. The melody grew louder, distorted, as if the box itself was screaming. The windows shattered inward and the temperature plummeted. Then came the laughter, soft, childlike, yet dripping with malice. "Who's there?" Jason demanded, his voice trembling. The laughter stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, one by one, the doors and windows in the school began to slam shut, the sound reverberating like thunder. A voice, low and guttural, filled the room. "You shouldn't have come." The group spun around, but no one was there. Instead, shapes began to form in the shadows, tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and mouths stretched into endless screams. They moved unnaturally, their limbs twisting at impossible angles. Liz screamed as one lunged at her, its icy fingers grazing her arm. The touch burned, leaving a blackened mark that spread like ink under her skin. The others grabbed her and ran, the music box still blaring behind them. But the school had changed. The hallways were longer, the stairs spiraling endlessly downward. The walls writhed, faces pressing against the plaster as if trying to break free. Split up, Liz yelled, her panic overriding reason. They scattered, their screams echoing through the maze of shifting corridors. Jason found himself in the gymnasium, now filled with rows of nooses swaying gently. Mia stumbled into the library where books flew off the shelves, their pages whispering her name. Ethan ran to the cafeteria, only to find tables laden with rotting food and skeletal hands clawing at the air. Liz ended up back in room 301, the music box now spinning wildly, its melody a discordant roar. The shadows in the room solidified into a figure, a woman in tattered robes, her eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Her face was etched with hatred, her mouth curling into a sinister grin. "You opened the door," the woman hissed, her voice layered with countless others. "Now, you belong to us." Liz tried to run, but the woman raised a hand and the door slammed shut. The last thing Liz saw was the music box opening wider, revealing a dark void that pulled her in. The next morning, the school was quiet. The janitor found the music box on a desk in room 301, its lid closed. Of Liz, Jason, Mia, and Ethan, there was no sign. The police searched for weeks, but the students were never found. The only clue was the music box, which no one dared to wind. Room 301 was sealed again, this time with heavy chains and a warning scrawled across the door in red paint. "Do not enter. Ever." Yet the whispers persisted, and every now and then the haunting melody could be heard echoing through the halls. And every time it played, someone new went missing.
Story number 3.
The storm rolled in like an omen, casting eerie shadows across the desolate Pinecrest Academy. The school was perched on a hill at the edge of town, its towering silhouette a black scar against the turbulent sky. Pinecrest had been abandoned for over 50 years, ever since the incident, a fire that claimed the lives of 47 students and 3 teachers during a talent show. No one knew how it started, but whispers claimed the blaze was no accident. Despite its history, the academy remained a popular destination for thrill seekers and paranormal investigators. No one ever stayed long. The building had a way of gnawing at your mind, making you feel as though unseen eyes were watching. That didn't stop Chloe, Alex, Emma, and Ben from venturing inside one Halloween night, determined to live stream their exploration to a growing audience of curious viewers. The air inside the school was suffocating, thick with mildew and the faint scent of burned wood. Their flashlights illuminated graffiti-covered walls and broken desks scattered across the floor. Emma adjusted her camera, ensuring the stream was live. Comments flooded in from viewers, urging them to explore deeper, calling them brave and foolish. "This place gives me the creeps," Ben muttered, his voice echoing. "That's the point," Chloe said, her tone light, though her grip on the flashlight tightened. "We're making history tonight." They moved cautiously through the halls, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust and debris. Every creak of the old building made them jump, but they laughed it off, blaming the wind or their own paranoia. At first, the school seemed like any other abandoned building, until they reached the auditorium. The doors were strangely pristine, untouched by the decay that consumed the rest of the school. Alex pushed them open, revealing rows of charred seats and a stage that seemed eerily intact. On the stage stood a grand piano, its surface gleaming as if it had been polished recently. "That's not creepy at all," Emma whispered, zooming in on the piano. The chat erupted with demands for someone to play it. Chloe stepped forward, brushing dust off the keys. "I used to take lessons," she said, forcing a smile. "Might as well give the viewers what they want." As her fingers pressed the keys, a discordant melody echoed through the auditorium. The notes were haunting, wrong, as though the piano resisted her touch. Then a second sound joined in, soft, muffled applause coming from the empty seats. Emma swung her camera toward the audience, her breath hitching. In the beam of her flashlight, faint outlines began to materialize. Rows of translucent figures sat in the chairs, their faces obscured but their hands clapping slowly. The applause grew louder, filling the space like a thunderous roar. "Run!" Alex yelled, grabbing Chloe's arm. They bolted toward the exit, but the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The figures rose from their seats, their movements slow and jerky, like marionettes on tangled strings. Ben pounded on the doors, his shouts drowned out by the echoing applause. "They're locking us in!" "No, we're not locked in," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "We were invited." The stage lights flickered on, casting an unnatural glow over the auditorium. The piano began playing by itself, the melody a twisted, chaotic wail. The figures advanced, their faces becoming clearer. They were burned, charred flesh, hanging from bone, eyes hollow, mouths frozen in eternal screams. One figure stepped forward, a woman in a scorched dress. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, and she raised a skeletal hand pointing at Chloe. "You'll play for us," the woman rasped, her voice like the crackle of flames. "You must finish the song." "No, I won't," Chloe shouted, backing away. But the air around her thickened, pressing her toward the piano. Her hands moved against her will, playing the keys as tears streamed down her face. The melody grew louder, the figures swaying as though caught in a macabre dance. Emma dropped her camera and screamed as the figures turned their empty eyes toward her. One lunged, its blackened fingers sinking into her arm, dragging her toward the seats. The others followed, pulling Alex and Ben into the audience, their cries of terror muffled by the applause. Chloe's fingers bled as she continued to play, her body trembling. "Please," she begged, "let them go." The woman's charred face twisted into a cruel smile. "Finish the song, and you can join them." The piano erupted in flames, the heat searing Chloe's skin. She screamed as her body was consumed, yet her hands never stopped playing. The final note rang out like a death knell, and then there was silence. The next morning, Pinecrest Academy stood as it always had, silent and foreboding. But in the auditorium, the piano was gone. In its place were 4 new charred seats, their occupants barely visible but forever trapped, their faces frozen in anguish. And somewhere in the distance, faint applause echoed, waiting for the next performance.
Story number 4.
In the small town of Ashgrove, nestled deep in the woods, there was a bridge known as Hollow Creek Crossing. The bridge was old, its wooden planks weathered and worn, and it stretched over a shallow, murky stream. It was said that on quiet nights you could hear the voices of the drowned echoing beneath it. No one dared to cross it after sunset, except for those who wanted to test the legend of the Beckoner. The story went that if you stood in the middle of the bridge at midnight and whispered, "Who's calling?" 3 times, you'd hear a voice answering from the water below. It would mimic someone you knew, your mother, your best friend, or even your own voice. But the voice would be wrong, warped, and if you stayed to listen, the Beckoner would claim you. Nina, a high school senior, didn't believe in ghost stories. Her friends dared her to try it during a Halloween bonfire, laughing and promising her free coffee for a week if she survived the night. With an eye roll and a flashlight, she accepted the challenge. The woods were deathly quiet as she approached the bridge, the flashlight beam cutting through the fog. The old boards creaked under her feet, and a faint smell of mildew and decay rose from the water below. She reached the middle of the bridge and checked her watch, 11:59 p.m. "Easy," she muttered, brushing off the shiver crawling up her spine. When midnight struck, Nina leaned over the railing, staring into the black water. The air grew still, the world around her holding its breath. Feeling foolish, she whispered, "Who's calling?" The silence stretched on. She repeated the question twice more, her voice growing steadier, her confidence returning. Then she heard it. "Nina?" The voice was soft, tentative. It sounded like her mother, but thinner, weaker. She froze. Her mother was at home, asleep, or so she told herself. "Mom?" she called hesitantly, her heart pounding. "Come down, Nina," the voice replied, almost pleading. "Help me." A chill raced through her. She backed away from the edge, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. But as she turned to leave, the voice changed. It was no longer her mother. Now it was her best friend, Sarah. "Nina, wait! It's me! I'm stuck down here. Please don't leave me." She stopped, her mind reeling. Sarah had texted her an hour ago, perfectly fine. This was impossible. "You're not Sarah," she said aloud, her voice shaking. "You're not real." The voice laughed then, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the woods. "You're right. I'm not Sarah. I'm not your mother, but I know you, Nina. I know everything about you." The air grew colder, frost forming on the railing of the bridge. The water below began to churn violently, and shapes, human shapes, emerged, their faces pale and featureless. They reached for her with skeletal hands, their mouths opening in silent screams. "Stay and listen," the beckoner's voice commanded, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "Stay, and you'll understand what it feels like to drown in the dark." Terrified, Nina turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the wood. The bridge seemed to stretch endlessly, the far side retreating further into the fog with each step. The voices followed her, growing louder, more insistent. "You can't run, Nina. You called me. I'm coming for you." Finally, she broke through the fog and stumbled onto solid ground. Behind her, the bridge loomed, its silhouette fading as the fog thickened. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. She didn't stop running until she reached the bonfire, where her friends were laughing and joking, oblivious to her ordeal. Breathless and pale, she tried to explain what had happened, but they waved her off, thinking it was a prank. Nina didn't sleep that night. She couldn't shake the sound of the beckoner's voice or the way it had known her deepest fears. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. She heard her name whispered in empty hallways and saw ripples in puddles that shouldn't have been there. Then, one night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. "Nina," the voice called, soft and cold, from beneath her window. She didn't dare look. By morning, her room was empty. The window left wide open. All that remained was a damp handprint on the sill and the faint echo of laughter in the distance.
Story number 5.
The old hospital on the edge of town, Crestwood Asylum, had been abandoned for decades. Its towering facade was hidden behind overgrown vines and shattered windows that seemed to weep darkness. Locals called it the breathing house because, on cold nights, mist would rise from its broken chimney, as though the building itself exhaled. No one entered Crestwood willingly. The stories of patients disappearing, the sadistic treatments performed by Dr. Alden Graves, and the mass escape that led to dozens of deaths were enough to keep people away. Yet, every now and then, someone would vanish near the grounds, their last known location always the same, the entrance to the hospital's underground morgue. One rainy October night, a group of college students decided to break in. They wanted to debunk the legend of Crestwood's living morgue, a place where it was said the dead walked again if their names were called. Chloe, Marcus, Eric, and Sam armed themselves with flashlights, a Ouija board, and a camera, ready to stream their adventure. "This is going to go viral," Chloe said, brushing her damp hair from her face. She was the ringleader, always chasing a thrill. "Or we'll get arrested," Marcus muttered, looking uneasily at the rusted chain they were cutting through. As the chain fell with a heavy clang, the metal gate creaked open, revealing the crumbling hallway beyond. The air smelled of mildew and iron, and their flashlights revealed graffiti sprawled across peeling walls. They ventured deeper, their nervous laughter echoing in the empty space. "Let's find the morgue," Chloe said, checking the map she downloaded from an old paranormal blog. It showed a path leading to the basement, marked with the ominous note, "Keep out." The descent into the lower levels was suffocating. The stairs were damp and narrow, and the deeper they went, the colder it became. Their breaths fogged in the frigid air, and the dim flashlight beams flickered as if struggling to stay alive. When they reached the morgue, the door was ajar. Inside, rows of rusted steel drawers lined the walls, each one large enough to hold a body. The air was heavy, as if the room itself were pressing down on them. "This is it," Chloe whispered, setting the Ouija board on a metal slab in the center of the room. "Let's call someone." "Let's not," Sam said, his voice trembling. "We're already here. Isn't that enough?" But Chloe ignored him. "Who's the bravest?" she teased, looking at Marcus and Eric. With a groan, Marcus stepped forward. "Fine, let's get this over with." They sat around the Ouija board, placing their fingers on the planchette. Chloe took a deep breath and spoke clearly. "We're calling out to anyone who died here. If you're still in this place, give us a sign." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, they heard it, a soft tapping sound, like fingernails against glass. Eric turned his flashlight toward the drawers. "It's just a rat," he said, trying to convince himself. Chloe smiled, emboldened. "Let's ask for a name." She looked at Marcus. "Go ahead." "Fine," Marcus said. "Who's here with us?" The planchette jerked suddenly, sliding to the letter A, then L. "Not funny," Sam said, glaring at Chloe. "I'm not doing it," she insisted. The planchette continued to spell ALDEN. The tapping grew louder, coming from multiple drawers now. The group froze as one of the steel doors creaked open on its own. Inside was empty, no body, just a black void that seemed deeper than it should be. "Dr. Alden Graves," Chloe whispered, her bravado fading. "That's impossible." Suddenly, the drawer slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the lights went out. Panic erupted as their flashlights flickered back on. The tapping was everywhere now, coming from all sides. "Let's get out of here!" Sam yelled, scrambling for the door. But the door wouldn't budge. Eric pounded on it, his hands trembling. "It's locked! How is it locked?" Then came the voice, a deep, gravelly whisper that filled the room. "You shouldn't have come." The drawers began to open, one after another. From each emerged figures, their bodies broken and decayed, their eyes hollow and black. They moved slowly at first, dragging themselves out of the steel confines, but their pace quickened as they closed in on the group. Marcus screamed as cold, skeletal hands grabbed his ankles, pulling him toward one of the drawers. "Help me," he shouted, his nails scraping against the tile floor. But the others could only watch in horror as he was dragged inside, the drawer slamming shut behind him. "Run!" Chloe shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The morgue seemed to stretch infinitely, the walls warping and twisting. The dead surrounded them, their moans a chilling symphony. Chloe, Eric, and Sam tried to fight, but one by one, they were claimed. The last thing Chloe saw before the darkness consumed her was Dr. Alden Graves, his burned and disfigured face leering down at her, a scalpel glinting in his hand. By morning, the gate to Crestwood Asylum was chained shut once again. The students were never found, but their camera was discovered in the woods nearby. The footage ended abruptly, with Chloe staring into the lens, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Don't call their names. Don't let them know you're here." And then the screen went black.
Story number 6.
The Whispering Fields were a place avoided by everyone in Mill Haven. Stretching for miles, the wheat swayed unnaturally even when there was no breeze, and the air was heavy with a strange, sweet scent. Generations of farmers had tried to cultivate the land, but the fields seemed cursed. Tools broke, crops withered, and those who stayed too long claimed to hear voices whispering their darkest fears. Some never returned at all. One autumn night, a group of friends, Lila, Ethan, Grace, and Jordan, dared each other to spend the night in the fields. The challenge was simple. Walk to the center, where an old scarecrow stood, and stay until sunrise. Armed with flashlights and a bottle of whiskey for courage, they set out, laughing and joking to mask their nerves. The air was still as they entered the fields, the towering stalks of wheat blocking out the moonlight. Their flashlights cast long, eerie shadows that danced on the ground. The laughter faded as they realized how quiet it was. Too quiet. No insects chirped, no wind rustled the wheat. Only the soft crunch of their footsteps broke the silence. "It's just a field," Ethan said, forcing a grin. "Nothing to be scared of." "Then why does it feel like we're being watched?" Grace whispered, clutching Lila's arm. They reached the scarecrow just past midnight. It was old and rotting, its straw-stuffed body slumped on the wooden pole. Its burlap face was twisted into a grotesque grin, and its button eyes seemed to follow them as they moved. The air around it was colder, and the sweet scent was stronger here, almost sickening. Jordan pulled out the whiskey and took a long swig before passing it around. "See, we made it. Nothing to worry about." But as the bottle made its way back to him, they heard it. A faint whispering, too low to make out. It seemed to come from all directions, carried on a breeze they couldn't feel. "Did you hear that?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Ethan said, but he didn't sound convinced. "There is no wind," Grace shot back, her eyes darting nervously through the wheat. The whispering grew louder, still unintelligible but insistent, like 100 voices speaking at once. The friends huddled together, their flashlights flickering. "Maybe we should leave," Lila said. But when they turned to go, the path they had come down was gone. The wheat had closed in around them, an impenetrable wall. No matter which direction they looked, all they could see was endless stalks of wheat and the faint glimmer of the scarecrow's button eyes. This isn't possible," Jordan stammered, his voice cracking. Then the scarecrow moved. It was subtle at first, a twitch of the head, the slight shift of a limp arm, but soon it was writhing, pulling itself free from the pole. The burlap face stretched, the twisted grin widening to reveal rows of jagged teeth. "Run." The whispering formed into a single word, echoing in their minds. They bolted, shoving through the wheat, their flashlights barely piercing the darkness. The sweet scent grew stronger, choking them as they stumbled blindly. Behind them, they heard the rustling of the scarecrow's pursuit, each movement accompanied by a guttural, rasping sound. Lila screamed as a hand, cold and impossibly strong, grabbed her ankle, dragging her to the ground. Ethan turned back to help, but when he shone his flashlight on her, she was gone. Only flattened wheat remained where she had fallen. "Keep running," Grace cried, tears streaming down her face. One by one, the group was picked off. Grace's screams were the next to fade into the whispering, followed by Jordan's desperate cries. Ethan was the last. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing. The whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of voices laughing, crying, and taunting. The scarecrow emerged from the wheat, its grin impossibly wide. It knelt beside him, its button eyes glinting in the pale light. "Why?" Ethan managed to choke out. The scarecrow leaned closer, and for the first time, its whispers were clear. "Because you came." By morning, the whispering fields were still. The wheat swayed gently in the breeze, and the scarecrow was back on its pole, its grin as twisted as ever. Of the four friends, there was no trace, save for a single flashlight lying at the edge of the field, its beam still faintly flickering. And from deep within the wheat, the whispers waited for the next visitors.
Story number 7.
The village of Ravenshallow was known for its peculiar clock tower. It stood in the center of town, ancient and imposing, with its blackened bricks and tarnished brass clock face. The hands of the clock had not moved in over a century, frozen at 3:33. Locals called it the dead hour, and no one dared to be near the tower when the time came. Legend had it that the clock stopped after a tragedy. A clockmaker named Elias Grayson had been working on the tower's mechanism late one night when the bells began to toll on their own. The townsfolk rushed to investigate, but found nothing except Elias's lifeless body sprawled at the base of the tower, his face twisted in terror. Since that night, strange things began to happen at 3:33. Doors would slam, whispers filled empty rooms, and shadows moved without cause. People claimed the clock tower was cursed, a gateway to something dark. One rainy evening, a group of thrill-seekers decided to test the legend. Mara, Jake, Elena, and Victor were paranormal enthusiasts who traveled to places of infamy, documenting their investigations for a growing online audience. Ravenshallow's clock tower was their latest challenge. "This place is creepy, I'll give it that," Jake said as they approached the tower. The rain slicked the cobblestones, and the air was heavy with the scent of moss and rust. Mara, the leader of the group, pulled out her camera and started recording. Perfect ambiance. Let's see if the stories are true. The tower door was unlocked, creaking open to reveal a spiral staircase winding up into darkness. The air inside was colder, carrying the faint smell of oil and decayed wood. Flashlights illuminated dusty gears and frayed ropes as they ascended, their footsteps echoing ominously. At the top, they found the clock's inner workings, a massive, intricate mechanism of wheels and pulleys, all coated in grime. The giant pendulum hung still, as though frozen in time. In the center of the room stood a strange object, an ornate brass mirror framed by gears, its surface dark and polished to a sinister sheen. "What's that doing here?" Elena asked, shivering as she stepped closer. "It's not in any of the photos we found," Victor added, scanning the room. Mara moved closer, the camera capturing the mirror's strange surface. "It looks wrong." Indeed, the mirror didn't reflect their surroundings correctly. The room behind them in the reflection was darker, the gears turning silently, and faint silhouettes moved within the glass, figures that weren't there in real life. "That's not us," Jake whispered, backing away. As they stared, the clock tower began to vibrate. The frozen clock hands outside creaked, shifting slightly. The pendulum jerked, moving with a loud clang. The bells above them began to toll, their sound deep and mournful. "It's 3:33, Elena gasped, glancing at her watch. The mirror's surface rippled, and one of the shadows stepped forward. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its movements jerky, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. Then another appeared, and another. "They're trying to get out," Victor said, his voice trembling. The first figure's hand pushed through the glass, its fingers impossibly long and sharp. The group screamed and stumbled back as the creature emerged fully, its hollow eyes fixed on them. The bells tolled louder, drowning out their cries as more figures crawled from the mirror. "Run!" Mara yelled, but the staircase seemed impossibly far away. The shadows moved faster than they should, their clawed hands reaching, their whispers echoing in the confined space. Victor was the first to fall, dragged back toward the mirror by multiple hands. His screams cut off abruptly as he disappeared into the glass. Elena followed, her flashlight spinning wildly as she was pulled into the reflection, her face frozen in terror. Mara and Jake made it to the staircase, but the steps twisted impossibly, leading them back to the top of the tower. The shadows surrounded them, their whispers growing louder, suffocating. The clock struck 3:34, and everything stopped. The room was silent, empty, as though nothing had happened. The mirror stood in its place, its surface smooth and dark once more. By morning, the clock tower was just as the villagers remembered, silent and foreboding, its hands frozen at 3:33. The thrill-seekers were never seen again, though some claimed to hear faint whispers coming from the top of the tower at night. And if you looked into the brass mirror on a moonless evening, you might see their faces staring back, forever trapped in the dead hour.
Story number 8.
In the quiet town of Black Hollow, there was a forest known as Deadwood Grove. It wasn't just the tangled trees or the perpetual fog that unnerved people. It was the dolls. Hundreds of them hung from the branches, their glass eyes dull and lifeless, their faces cracked and weathered. No one knew who had placed them there, but the locals whispered that the dolls marked the resting place of the lost, the children who had vanished in the forest over the years. Despite the warnings, teenagers often dared one another to enter the grove. Most came back shaken but unharmed, claiming they'd only heard strange noises or seen fleeting shadows. But some never returned, and their faces would appear in photos taken of the dolls soon after. One stormy autumn night, 3 friends, Cassie, Ryan, and Hannah, decided to explore Deadwood Grove. They weren't locals, just passing through on a road trip, and they didn't believe the stories. "It's just some creepy folklore," Ryan said, his flashlight cutting through the dense fog. "Nothing to be scared of." Cassie wasn't so sure. She felt the weight of the dolls' empty gazes as they passed beneath the hanging figures. Some swayed gently in the wind, their limbs creaking as though they were alive. "Why would anyone put these here?" she muttered. "They probably wanted to scare people like us," Hannah replied, though her voice was uneasy. The path through the grove twisted unnaturally, the fog thickening with each step. Soon they couldn't tell which direction they had come from. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. "We should turn back," Cassie said, clutching Ryan's arm. "This doesn't feel right." But Ryan pressed on, determined to find the clearing at the center of the grove where, according to legend, the mother doll hung. It was said to be the first doll placed in the forest, and those who saw it would hear whispers calling them by name. The clearing was smaller than they expected, dominated by a single gnarled tree. From its highest branch hung the mother doll, a child-sized figure with a porcelain face and a dress that had once been white but was now stained with dirt and something darker. Its head was tilted, its mouth cracked into an unsettling half-smile. As they approached, a cold wind swept through the clearing, and the other dolls began to sway more violently. The whispers started then, faint at first, like distant voices carried on the breeze. "Do you hear that?" Hannah asked, her face pale. Ryan nodded, but he didn't stop. "It's just the wind," he said, though his hands trembled as he raised his flashlight toward the mother doll. The beam reflected off its glass eyes, making them seem to glint with malicious intent. "Ryan, let's go," Cassie pleaded. "This isn't funny anymore." Before he could respond, the whispers grew louder, distinctly forming their names. Cassie, Hannah, Ryan. Hannah screamed and turned to run, but the path had vanished. The trees had closed in around the clearing, their twisted roots writhing like snakes. "There's no way out," she cried. The mother doll's head moved, tilting to face them. Its smile widened impossibly, the porcelain cracking as it seemed to watch their panic. One by one, the other dolls' heads turned as well, their lifeless eyes now fixed on the 3 friends. Ryan dropped his flashlight, the beam flickering wildly as it hit the ground. "What is this?" he shouted, his voice breaking. The whispers turned into laughter, high-pitched, childlike, and utterly wrong. The dolls began to twitch, their limbs jerking as if trying to free themselves from the branches. Cassie grabbed Ryan and Hannah, pulling them toward the edge of the clearing. "We have to run! Now!" But the grove wouldn't let them leave. The dolls began to descend, their strings snapping as they fell to the ground. They moved toward the group with unnatural speed, their tiny hands clawing and grasping. One latched onto Hannah's leg, and she screamed as its cracked face looked up at her, its mouth moving as it whispered, "Stay with us." Cassie tried to pull Hannah free, but the dolls were too many. They swarmed, their laughter drowning out Hannah's cries as they dragged her into the fog. Ryan and Cassie ran blindly, the whispers and laughter chasing them. The trees seemed to shift, blocking their path, and the fog grew thicker. Ryan tripped and fell, His scream cut short as the dolls descended on him. Cassie ran until her lungs burned, but the grove had no end. The last thing she saw was the mother doll standing before her, its arms outstretched as if to embrace her. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence as darkness claimed her. The next morning, the townsfolk found a new doll hanging from the central tree. Its face was eerily familiar, porcelain with Cassie's features, her expression frozen in a silent scream. And in the grove, the whispers waited for the next trespassers to join their collection.
Story number 9.
In the small, forgotten town of Greystone, there was a peculiar bridge known as Widow's Crossing. It was an old, rickety structure that stretched over a black, still river. The bridge was shrouded in fog nearly every night, and the locals avoided it at all costs. They said the bridge was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a bride who had drowned on her wedding night. The legend was simple but chilling. Decades ago, a young woman named Eleanor was set to marry her childhood sweetheart. On the night of her wedding, her fiancé never arrived at the church. Heartbroken, Eleanor ran to the bridge, still in her wedding dress, and threw herself into the cold, dark water below. Her body was never found, but her spirit was said to linger, waiting for those foolish enough to cross the bridge after midnight. The stories claimed that if you heard her sobbing, you should never look back. Those who did were never seen again. One cold October night, 3 friends, Amber, Tyler, and Mia, decided to test the legend. They were skeks, always eager to debunk the supernatural, and Widow's Crossing seemed like the perfect challenge. "It's just a story to scare kids," Tyler said as they parked near the bridge. The headlights of the car barely pierced the dense fog that clung to the area like a living thing. Amber laughed nervously. "Let's just walk across, record some video, and call it a night." Mia hesitated, glancing at the bridge. It seemed to stretch endlessly into the fog, the wooden planks warped and slick with moisture. "I don't know about this," she said. "What if it's true?" "Then we'll be the first to prove it," Tyler replied, shouldering his camera. The trio stepped onto the bridge, their footsteps echoing eerily. The air was damp and cold, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood beneath their feet. Halfway across, the sobbing began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the river below, but as they stopped to listen, it grew louder, a mournful wail that seemed to come from all around them. Amber's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the planks. "Okay, that's creepy," she admitted, her bravado fading. "It's probably the wind," Tyler said, though his voice lacked confidence. He pointed the camera toward the fog, scanning for any sign of movement. "Hello?" he called out. "Is anyone there?" The sobbing stopped. Mia grabbed Amber's arm, her eyes wide. "We should go." But as they turned to leave, a figure emerged from the fog at the far end of the bridge. It was a woman in a tattered wedding dress, her veil torn and her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her lips moved silently, as though she were speaking words they couldn't hear. Amber froze. It's just someone playing a prank," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. The woman stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her bare feet didn't make a sound on the wooden planks, and her empty eyes seemed to fix on each of them in turn. "Don't look back," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "That's what the legend says." But Tyler couldn't resist. He turned the camera toward the figure, the lens capturing her in all her unnatural, horrific glory. The sobbing returned, louder now, almost deafening. The woman's mouth opened, revealing a black void, and she let out a scream that shattered the air. The flashlight went out. In the darkness, Mia and Amber could only hear Tyler's screams, abruptly cut off by a sickening splash. "Run!" Amber shouted, grabbing Mia's hand and dragging her toward the car. They ran blindly through the fog, the bridge seeming to stretch longer with each step. The sobbing followed them, closer now, almost whispering in their ears. When they finally reached the end of the bridge, they collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The fog began to lift, revealing the empty road ahead. Tyler was gone, and the camera lay on the ground, its lens shattered. Amber picked it up with shaking hands and rewound the footage. The final frame showed the bride standing directly behind Tyler, her hands outstretched, her hollow eyes filled with malice. To this day, no one knows what happened to Tyler, but locals say that if you stand on Widow's Crossing at midnight, you can hear his screams, mingling with the sobs of the bride, forever lost in the fog.